4 incorrect ways that people may approach God. So 4 incorrect ways. So wanting something from him rather than God himself. And so Jethani refers to these as postures. Okay, so according to him, each of these 4 incorrect postures ultimately end up being about ways that we are trying to control God, right? Ways that we are trying to control our lives. Control as a way then, to use God to achieve some other goal or purpose that we have. And so, in other words, God then becomes a means to your end and not the end goal, right? Not the desire of your heart. He becomes the means to that desire. And so, just very quickly, life under God. So essentially, you're living in fear of God. You're living in fear because you need to keep him happy so that he doesn't punish you by bringing calamity and hardships into your life. So in this way of approaching God, when things go well, he's with us because he's blessing us. But then when things go wrong, we can easily believe that we're being punished by God because he's mad at us. And so we try to live by the rules and perform rituals for God, rituals such as coming to worship, worshiping him, reading the Bible, praying. But why we do those things is in order to manipulate him, in order to try to appease him into being good towards us, and then also avoiding the bad stuff. Right? So that's life under God, life over God. So what we're after by coming to God in this posture are the principles or laws in which to live by. And so we're thinking, right, if we can control our lives by following these, godly principles that are ultimately from God. So for example, there's a lot of these self-help books out there, right? 7 Habits of Highly Effective People that you think, right, you follow these 7 habits, you will find success. And perhaps a more Christian way that we can think about it, right? Some sermons are often preached this way. For example, 3 biblical principles to a happy marriage. And so you come to God, and again, this is part of the challenge of trying to differentiate. You come to God not for him, but for those principles and for those laws, because you think that by following the principles or these laws, you will have control over your life, right? That you'll find success. The thirdly, life from God. So this was the younger son. And so essentially you see God as a vending machine, that he's there to supply all of your material desires. And so you are after the Father's wealth, or you're after there's blessing. And so you try to manipulate God in order to get the stuff that you want from him. And this may be particularly hard to tell because I can point out, right, for some, obedience in this scenario becomes a way you're trying to manipulate God to get what you want from him. Right? And again, that's why it's so hard to tell. That sometimes then obedience becomes the way you're trying to get God to give you the stuff that you want. Right? And finally, life for God. And so this was the older son. You use God and his mission in order to gain a sense of direction and meaning and value and purpose in your life. And again, also perhaps very hard to distinguish, but in essence, what you want from God is not him, but that sense of purpose, that sense of meaning that his mission gives you. Okay? Right? So to summarize this, all right, ways that someone may come to God, but it's not for God, is under, right, for security and peace by living according to his rules, right, over, right, principles to live by, therefore you basically become God, right, you can control your own life, from material blessings, or for a sense of meaning, purpose, direction in your life. And I know I went through these relatively quickly. Again, there's a whole book written about this, and so you can refer to the book if you're interested to learn more. But as you think about it, again, I need to point out, right, how many of us deep down believe in some version of this? That we come to God not actually wanting him, but something that we can get from him. However, according to Skye Jethani, there is also a fifth way to approach God. And this, as he says, is the more biblical, the more healthy way of relating to God. And so and this is the way that God intended. And he calls that life with God. And so life with God is different because the goal is not to use God as a means to your end. But God is the goal. He is the end goal. He ceases to be a device that we're employing or a commodity that we're consuming to get what we desire. But God himself becomes the focus of our desire. However, the problem, according to Jethani, is he says the reason most people gravitate towards one of the other four incorrect postures is because they've, in fact, never received a clear vision of who God is, and so they settle for something less. As he's a holy desire to know God, to experience his presence in their lives, to be cared for like sheep entrusted to a meek and gentle shepherd. But this is not what they see or experience. In fact, they may leave the church without ever seeing a beautiful and enthralling vision of life with God. Instead, they are offered a substitute form of Christianity, one that cannot break through the shadows and that never really satisfies the deepest longings of their souls. In other words, what he is saying here is that many actually don't know or actually don't have an idea or a picture in their mind of what being with God looks like. Right? Many actually come, but they don't have an idea of what that is or what that looks like to be with God, right? We've never experienced it. It's never been described accurately. And you can think about that in your own faith experience, right? Because then, again, how would you articulate to someone your relationship with God? How would you describe your experience of being with him? And as you think, right, if you can't describe it, maybe herein lies the issue for you. That perhaps some here, that what we're talking about, has summarized your Christian experience. That you've been sold something other than the opportunity to know God, to experience him, to have his presence in your life, to have a life with him. And if what you have been doing, and again, especially tricky, if you've been serving and active and participating in the life of the church, but yet, again, if these Christian things you're doing isn't ultimately because you are cultivating and growing a relationship, a life with God, then it misses the point. That in fact is not Christianity. That's not what it's ultimately about. And in this way, perhaps you need a restart in your life, right? A reboot to shift your posture from approaching God as a means to your treasure to God, in fact, being the treasure in your life.